All right, well, we want to welcome you back to part two of something that we were talking about 15 minutes ago. And, we don't want to create a 3-hour video, so we'd rather break it up a little bit. So we did part one, and we're covering the same subject here in part two, but it's really all about these riots, looting, arson, in some cases murder, that has broken out in the United States of America really over the last month. I'm sorry, the last week, roughly.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the tragic death of George Floyd, which we all agree was tragic and needs to be punished to the full extent of the law.
Amen, yes.
But what is happening with these protests is his death is being exploited. It's being used as a tool to critique all of American society as racist at its core. And that whole society needs to be toppled and replaced with Marxism.
Right.
And so people that are all kind of pulled into this rioting are actually becoming what we're going to call useful idiots for a Marxist revolution. And this, why are you talking about this in a church? Well, we talk about prophecy here.
Yes.
And we know a new world order is coming.
That's right.
And really the last holdout to the coming new world order is a free and prosperous United States of America. And what you're seeing before your very eyes is the justification for toppling it and replacing it. And actually, the playbook for this, we're not going to go back into this playbook, but we quoted a lot of it in part one.
Yes.
It's a document most likely written by Bill Ayers, the famous or infamous Weather Underground terrorist. And the title of it is Burn Down the American Plantation, a call for a revolutionary abolitionist movement. And that is who we believe is ultimately behind these protesters.
Yeah, I think so.
So we've looked at, number one, the revolutionary abolitionist movement. Number two, the call for reparations, which really is just a code word for Marxism.
Yeah.
Number three, the exploitation of the tragic death of George Floyd. Number four, the involvement of George Soros in these protests. His money seems to be heavily involved in it.
Yeah.
Number five, well-known communist agitators are involved in these protests. And number six, when you look at bricks appearing at just the right time, it looks to be more of not just an anarchy, but a planarchy. Not just a pandemonium, but a plandemonium.
Yeah.
Now, here's something very interesting, Brother Jim, as we look at here, number seven, is what is the reaction of the red-green axis to all of these things?
Yeah.
Of course, the red-green axis is the sworn enemies of the United States around the world. Red, communism; green, Islam. They remind me a lot of what was it, Pilate and Herod. It talks about they became fast friends that day when it got to getting rid of Christ, because the only thing they hated more than each other was Jesus. And so they teamed up. And that's exactly what's happening.
That's exactly right.
And the two are going to team up until they get their new world order.
Right.
Then they're probably going to go to war with each other.
I think so.
But what is the reaction of the red-green axis to this? What is the reaction of Iran, Russia, China, Turkey, as they watch mayhem and burning and looting and protesting going on, in our streets? I mean, what is the reaction of what's the guy's name in charge of Russia? Putin.
Yeah.
I mean, if he celebrated Christmas, which obviously he doesn't, I'm sure he would think Christmas came early.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just beside himself as to what's happening. In fact, we have an article here from the Jerusalem Post entitled by Seth Frantzman, June 2nd, 2020, Iran, Russia, China, Turkey celebrate collapse of U.S. The goal of these countries during the current U.S. crisis is to use it to their advantage to achieve gains. What does that first paragraph say?
Authoritarian regimes throughout the world are pushing narratives that appear to gloat over and celebrate the chaos unfolding in the United States. On Monday, Iran's media pushed stories that highlighted the, quote, collapse, close quote, while quoting Russian sources portraying that the U.S. is flailing about as its world order comes crashing down. Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I guess that's how you say that.
I think it's Erdogan.
Erdogan, okay, sought to capitalize on the recent riots in the U.S., claiming that America is part of an, quote, unjust order, close quote, in the world.
So this article has all these examples from the state-run TV or media in these countries, talking about how Iran, the Kremlin, Russia, Turkey, all part of that red-green axis, China, etc., are just completely beside themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, they cannot believe, their good fortune.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got an article here. This is in some new stuff that I brought in. The title of it is George Floyd Death. China takes a victory lap over U.S. protests. And it says as anti-racism protests sweep across the U.S., Beijing has seized upon them to hit back at Washington for supporting last year's Hong Kong pro-democracy demonstrations. Chinese state media have given extensive coverage to the protests, highlighting the chaotic scenes and alleged police brutality in America to claim that China enjoys greater social stability. I remember all these NBA athletes.
Can I just go,
Yeah. NBA athletes like Steve Kerr, for example, former NBA basketball player, was basically arguing that, China, the way they brutally treat people, is really no different than what we do in the United States as people walk into malls and gun down innocent people. So he's drawing a moral equivalence argument.
Goodness sakes.
And this kind of mayhem allows them to make those kind of arguments.
Goodness gracious.
I mean, look at that oppressive society. They're in no position to lecture anybody else about oppression. And so something can't be good if our sworn enemies are celebrating it.
Yeah.
And so that kind of gives us more of a window, does it not, into how to look at this. And we go here to number 7, where we're dealing now with the social distancing double standard.
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't it a week ago we were all under lockdown and social distancing was being enforced to the point where a business owner in Dallas that opens up her salon is thrown in jail?
Yep.
And she has to show contrition before the judge to the injury she's committed to society.
Yep.
Well, now you have these mobs of people standing right next to each other in all of this looting activity. What happened to social distancing?
Yeah.
Nobody seems to care about it anymore. In fact, here's an article from FoxNews.com. Big city Dems who had imposed strict coronavirus lockdowns now let George Floyd rioters flout the rules. And notice how Andrew Cuomo is caught with his hand in the cookie jar.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The coronavirus lockdown is seemingly down and out as many Democrats in charge of big cities, including several who once insisted on strict quarantine measures, line up to champion the nationwide mass demonstrations over the in-custody death of George Floyd sans social distancing. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo lashed out at protesters calling to reopen the state earlier this month, saying at a news conference, quote, "You have no right to jeopardize my health and my children's health and your children's health," close quote. Cuomo's directives have been enforced throughout the state. A New York City tanning salon owner told Fox News he was fined $1,000 for reopening briefly last week, calling the situation, quote, insane, close quote, and saying he already was, quote, broke. On Friday, though, Cuomo said he, quote, stands with those defying stay-at-home orders. Nobody is sanctioning the arson and the thuggery and the burglaries, but the protesters and the anger and the fear and the frustration? Yes, yes. and the demand is for justice, close quote.
So, social distancing applies to running your business, going to church, but it doesn't apply as long as you're promoting the right cause.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're out there campaigning for justice. You know, the virus is very smart, apparently. I mean, it knows how to work in a church
Isn't that fascinating?
or in a business,
Yeah.
but all of a sudden it stops working in the midst of a George Floyd mass protest
Wow.
and looting and riot.
Imagine that.
De Blasio, the mayor of New York, said the same thing. An article from, did I get my articles wrong there? Yeah, the first article was from Fox News. This one is from Fox News. The title of it is De Blasio is slammed for halting prayer gatherings, but not protests. The mayor cites 400 years of American racism. So as long as you're out there protesting the corruption of America, then the social distancing doesn't apply to you.
Yeah.
And I guess the virus isn't working.
Yeah.
That's astounding, isn't it? Is that a double standard that's difficult to see?
Yes, it is. Very much so. Very much so.
I mean, it's a double standard, but it's not difficult to see. If anybody wants to rub two brain cells together. Here's another article from NPR. Protesting racism versus risking COVID-19. I wouldn't weigh these crises separately, by Bill Chappell, June the 1st, 2020. This is another staggering statement by otherwise people that are fairly smart.
It is the NPR, though. Mass protests that have erupted over police brutality toward black people in America are raising concerns about the risk of spreading the coronavirus. But some health experts, even as they urge caution, said they support the demonstrations because racism also poses a dire health threat.
So, COVID-19, social distancing for normal life, we're going to enforce that. But as long as you're protesting a greater health threat, racism, then social distancing doesn't apply.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think these are obvious things that we can use to show that we're being heavily manipulated and heavily propagandized.
I think it's time to reopen America, folks. Come on, get the picture here, right?
Yeah, here's another article concerning social distancing double standard. The NYPD, the LAPD send cops to harass Hasidic Jews and baseball players for social distancing violations, from redstate.com, June the 3rd, 2020, Elizabeth Bond. This concerns, again, New York City. Countless stores have been looted and vandalized. Rioters have damaged property throughout the city, and some have resorted to violence. But amazingly, de Blasio's NYPD had time to send officers to Orthodox Hasidic Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn to warn them of arrest if they choose to attend prayer services later that evening. So as New York is burning, he's enforcing social distancing against Hasidic Jews attending a prayer gathering, while these looters violate the law, march in lockstep, and social distancing doesn't apply to them. I mean, look, I was born in the morning, but it wasn't yesterday morning. And if we can't see through a double standard like this, I feel this way about it, Brother Jim. If we can't see through a double standard like this, then we deserve to be enslaved by Marxism.
Yeah.
Well, moving on to our next category. Feel free to jump in. You're speechless over
I'm just sitting here thinking about, they won't let these kids play baseball. Maybe if they were out in the streets with their baseball bats swinging them at windows, it'd have been okay.
That's exactly right. We come here to number 9, where these looters are vandalizing not just any sites, but historic sites.
Yeah.
So here's an article from amgreatness.com, Antifa rioters deface World War II, and Lincoln memorials on the National Mall. Here's another article from NBCWashington.com where there's a historic church near the White House that's damaged.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's another article from NBCnews.com by a couple of individuals. The title of it is Nashville. Now we're in Nashville. Nashville's historic courthouse and city hall set on fire.
Yeah.
And I guess what I would like for people to understand is there's a reason they're attacking all of these historic sites. They're institutionally or systematically biased or racist, and they have to go.
Yeah.
So that's the reason these historic sites are being targeted. You know who else is being targeted in these riots, Brother Jim, is black-owned businesses. Now, why would they do that? If you're protesting racial issues, why would you attack a black-owned business? Because the Marxist concept is they don't want blacks to be successful and prosperous
Exactly.
and independently wealthy
Exactly.
and to have their own resources. They want them dependent and angry and seething with revolutionary hatred because they're more easy to manipulate that way.
Well, and the only way they can be successful, like you just mentioned, is through the capitalistic system.
That's right.
It can't happen through communism.
That's right. Communism, well, it makes us all equal,
Yeah,
equally poor,
yeah.
except the people running the system. They live like royalty, while the rest of us starve to death. And, you know, it's interesting, it mentions this church that was burned.
Yeah.
This was the same church that Donald Trump went across the street to. We actually have a picture of it where he held up his Bible in front of the church.
Yes, he sure did.
St. John's Church Parish House, and there's a picture of Donald Trump out in front of the church holding up the Bible. Now, I've never seen more hysteria against that than perhaps any single thing Donald Trump has done. I could not believe the reaction, how the left completely spoke out against this. Now, why would they speak out against a man, a president, holding up a Bible in front of a church? Well, the answer is to them, the Bible is a symbol of oppression. Because after all, the Bible says slaves submit to your masters.
Yep.
The Bible talks about the cursed race of Ham, which has been mistaught as the black race.
Yep. That's
and
right.
so they think the Bible is a symbol of oppression. Now, they don't understand that those are all perversions of the Bible.
Well, they're God haters too. Let's just call a spade here.
Yeah. In fact, there was a book, did you know this, written in the Civil War era? It's called The Bible Against Slavery. And it was basically a pastor using the Bible to argue against slavery. And in fact, William Wilberforce, an evangelical Christian, used his beliefs in the Bible to persevere. There's a whole movie about him.
Yeah, that's
to eradicate the slave trade.
Yeah.
So this idea that somehow the Bible is a symbol of oppression is not what the Bible teaches.
No.
In fact, I think the Bible contains within it the principles that would one day eradicate slavery.
Absolutely.
Because the Bible teaches that all of us bear God's image, regardless
exactly right.
of what pigment color
That's exactly
our
right.
skin, happens to be or not be.
That's right.
And so it's unjust for one race to enslave another.
Correct.
And by the way, is the black race the only race that's ever been enslaved?
No.
I think when you look into some of the writings of Thomas Sowell, particularly Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams, they make the historical case that every race has been subjected to slavery at some point.
That's
I mean,
right.
it goes right back
That's exactly
into the
right.
book of Exodus. It was the Jews that were enslaved in Egypt.
Right.
And so, I hope people don't buy into this narrative that somehow the Bible is an instrument of oppression. It's not at all. It's the opposite.
Yeah.
So Trump holding up the Bible has caused hysterics. Of course, when Bill Clinton holds up the Bible during some of his shenanigans in the 1990s,
Surprised it didn't go up in flames.
nobody seemed to be bothered by that. So
No.
again, it's just another case of a blatant double standard.
Yeah.
And we come here to number 10, Brother Jim, and we have what's being made a moral equivalence argument.
This is great. This is great.
And the argument that's basically being made is these rioters are really no different than those that were involved in the Boston Tea Party.
Modern day revolutionaries, right?
Now, is that true? We have this article from wallbuilders.com. One of the things I really like about Wall Builders is when you look at their footnoted material, and in the internet age, you just click on the link and it takes you right to the original source, is they don't make statements unless it's backed by historical primary sources.
Right.
I mean, let's go right into the writings of Adams or Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin or whoever and see what they said.
Yeah.
So you want to read that first paragraph
Sure.
to us? Because I think a lot of people are swept into this, that these rioters this week, it's no different than the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah. And the title of this article here was "The Boston Tea Party a Riot?" And this is from June 2nd, 2020. Recently, America has witnessed a horrific tragedy in the killing of George Floyd by a police officer. In defense of these heinous acts, some people have begun pointing to the Boston Tea Party as an example of how violent riots are part of American tradition. This historical perspective, however, is only possible if you don't know the first thing about the Boston Tea Party, who was involved, and why it happened.
And they make 2 points. First, unlike what's happening on our television screens, the Boston Tea Party was 100% peaceful. And I really didn't know this until I read this article.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
With no looting, rioting, injury, or destruction of persons or private property.
Wow.
It was just, the tea was coming. They had no choice in the matter. If they submitted to it, they would be submitting to tyranny, taxation without representation.
Right.
And so they quietly took the tea and dumped it into the harbor. And the article goes on and it quotes, my goodness, who is quoted here? Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, talking about how quiet an event this was. In fact, here's a quote from John Adams, America's second president. It's footnote 11. And again, you just click on that little link there and it takes you right to the writings of John Adams. It says, "The town of Boston was never more still and calm of a Saturday than it was last night. All things were conducted with great order and decency and perfect submission to government." That's not what's happening right now.
This was the morning after the Tea Party.
This is morning.
The next morning.
And there's a lot of other primary historical
y'all
sources
need to read
as
this.
well. Yeah, and I wish we had time to
This is amazing stuff.
read the whole thing. Then they have a second point. Secondly, the colonists had only 2 options remaining them in the situation: pay the unjust tax or throw the tea into the harbor. In other words, the whole premise is taxation without representation. To protest that as tyranny, this was their only option.
Yeah, it didn't say blow up the ship and kill everyone on board.
That's exactly
It
right.
didn't say that.
You mind reading that paragraph
Glad
to us?
to.
Bottom of page 25.
Yeah, the Bostonians, along with all the other American colonists, had no representation in the English Parliament, who were passing laws like the 1773 Tea Act. By the way, folks, this is history that kids don't get to hear about
Exactly
anymore.
right.
This meant that the colonists had no real legal way to seek the redress of their grievances. Therefore, the famous motto became, quote, "No taxation without representation," close quote.
And it goes on once again and
Yep.
quotes John Adams and a number of others that were there when this happened. And then we come here to page 27 in our notes. And do you mind reading those last 2 paragraphs to us there? The situation in America today is entirely different.
Yeah, and again, please go back and look at all these notes. They're excellent. The situation in America today is entirely different. Respect and decency are not being shown to innocent people or business owners. The current riots are like a destructive tornado set on destroying everything in its path. Peaceful protests are protected by the Bill of Rights, which is very interesting. You know, you had the Tea Party that they knew that had happened. They could have come in and said, we're not going to allow that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't do that. They allowed for rights for peaceful protests. I'm sorry, I had to say that. Peaceful protests are protected by the Bill of Rights, but violent riots which destroy, loot, and victimize are antithetical to the American idea. The comparison of the violent riots to the Boston Tea Party is wildly unfounded and demonstrates that Americans should study their history before they try to weaponize it. That's a great paragraph.
That's a great paragraph. And you see a lot of this, like Reverend Al Sharpton speaking at George Floyd's memorial service, sort of making these moral equivalence type arguments that, well, the rioters are really no different than those in the Boston Tea Party. And that's what is happening. And I think, to be honest with you, those that are being influenced by the revolutionary abolitionist movement actually think this way because they honestly believe that their cause, overthrowing what they think is oppression and replacing our system with a communist system, is so right and is so just that the ordinary rules don't apply to them. That's why they're redefining rioting, they're redefining violence, etc.
Yeah, it's don't confuse me with the facts.
Exactly right. So, continuing on here, we come to number 11, and this is where we begin to use the expression useful idiots. And this is what is breaking my heart over this whole thing. In fact, of all of the things that have happened this week that have bothered me the most, it's watching people that otherwise are good people being swept into this mindset and becoming somehow apologists for this mob, saying, we're listening to you, we hear you, we want to conciliate or acquiesce to your demands, and they're acquiescing to the toppling of the United States and really a communist system without even realizing it. I mean, if it was just, again, not to sound like a broken record, if it was just a protest over a single bad actor, fine. We're all on board with that. But that's not what's being protested here. The very foundation and essence of America is being protested.
That's right.
Because supposedly it started with oppression and we never got rid of oppression. So that's the justification for toppling it and replacing it with something else. And so you have, first of all, those in the secular world, the non-evangelical world, that are basically being used as what I would call useful idiots. By the way, a useful idiot is not a pejorative. It's an actual documented term. I think it was used by Lenin, if I'm not mistaken. And basically the idea is we will get people that are unwitting and unknowing to parrot the communist line. The higher they are up in society, the more prominent they are, the better. And so Marxists have always worked this way. They've always looked for useful idiots. And by the way, once the communists grab power, the first group to go will be the useful idiots.
And as we're going to see here in just a second, what I see happen over and over again is these people who are the greatest money makers in our country in many cases are the ones that are supporting this, not realizing that they're going to be the first ones to go.
Like second string football players that have made more money that I'll see in a whole lifetime. Won't salute the American flag, won't show the country proper homage, etc., etc. That's what we mean by useful idiots. And so Mark Cuban, here's Mark Cuban. Mark Cuban is the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and he tweeted recently concerning all of this when it first broke out, "Dear white people." You want to read that? I don't know if I can bring myself.
All right. Dear white people, we are the ones that need to change. This is not one man's story. This is almost every black man's story, which is why the problem is ours. We need to find our way to change what we do. There is no quick fix. It's a moral imperative.
So it's not the fault of a racist. It's the fault of America,
Yeah.
which is racist, and it's the fault of all of us.
Yeah.
Because after all, Brother Jim, we're all racist
Yeah.
at the core.
Right.
It's part of the oxygen that we breathe.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the argument that's being made here.
Yeah.
He goes on. He was asked to explain himself. The more he talks,
Why?
the deeper hole he digs for himself. But what does he say in his second tweet?
All right. I used to think treating people equally meant treating them the same, like it was a math equation. I was wrong. I'm learning that treating people equally means treating them with equal amounts of respect for who they are and what they have experienced.
This is basically what's called white privilege
I don't even know what that means.
or white guilt.
This.
Yeah, it's
It doesn't even
nonsensical.
make sense to me.
But it's basically this idea that what happened to George Floyd is really the fault of all of us because we're all racist.
Yeah.
And we've all sort of benefited from this society at the backs of blacks.
Yeah.
And so, it's really all our fault. It's basically what he's getting at here.
Yeah.
I mean, he's taking the focus off
Mhm.
the bad actor and putting it onto a whole culture.
Yeah.
Is basically what he's doing. And
In the meantime, he continues to show up on Shark Tank on TV.
that's right.
Yeah.
Now, we have this tweet here from, the Fairfax Democrats. And here's actually an article from Breitbart.com. Fairfax County Democrats call riots part of this country's march to progress. So this is actually progress that we're seeing, this
Yeah.
looting and
Oh.
mayhem that's taking place. What does
Wow.
it say there?
The official Twitter account of the Fairfax County Democratic Committee in Virginia retweeted a claim on Saturday that, quote, riots are an integral part of this country's march toward progress, close quote, as the country was gripped by violence. Update. The tweet was deleted Monday afternoon, but survives in screenshot form.
And here it is in screenshot
And guess
form.
what we have for you? Yeah.
Fairfax Democrats, when President Obama included the Stonewall riots in his second inaugural, he didn't make that decision lightly. Riots are an integral part of this country's march towards progress. I don't know what category to put this under other than useful idiots. I mean, here you have and I'm not trying to be facetious about it at all, but here you have a riot taking place to dismantle America, and you have the Fairfax Democrats there in Virginia calling it progress? Progress to what? It's interesting I think it's MSNBC, they used to have the motto, leaning forward. What are we leaning forward towards?
Mm-hmm.
Or they use this term progress or progressives. What are we progressing towards? Have you ever asked yourself that? Well, what we're progressing towards is A, socialism, B, communism. Socialism will turn into communism.
Mm-hmm.
For the very simple reason that under socialism, people figure out that, gosh, I'm not getting ahead, so why work?
Mm-hmm.
And the communists come to power and put a gun to your head and say, this is why you're going to work. We're going to kill you if you don't work.
Yeah.
So socialism eventually leads to communism.
Mm.
And, in essence, this is what they define as progress. Even though communism and socialism hasn't worked anywhere, it's been tried. And why would you replace the document that has given more people more economic and political freedom than any other document in human history? Why would you replace our economy that's raised the standard of living for more people than any other economy in human history? Why do you want to tear that down? The argument is made because it's racist at its core.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what they're not telling you is what they want to replace it with.
Right.
What are we leaning forward towards?
Mm-hmm.
What are we progressing towards?
Yeah.
And kind of continuing on, here is a screenshot, if you will. Actually, before we get to that screenshot, let's talk about my boyhood idol. And he could shoot that skyhook. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. This is from Newsbusters.
Yeah.
CBS lines up experts to say white Americans have contempt for black life.
Mm-hmm.
On Monday, CBS this morning lined up so-called experts on race relations to accuse white Americans of being taught to have contempt for black life, and that racism was like, here we go, dust in the air, something ingrained in our society. Now, when we were going through the Burn Down the American Plantation document, one of the quotes we gave is oppression is part of the psyche of the American people. In other words, we're all racist, we just don't realize it.
Yeah.
So that's where you get this expression, dust in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Something ingrained in our society.
Yeah.
The nasty blanket statements were treated as objective facts rather than radical declarations. Mm-hmm. After the death of George Floyd, we're taking a look at history of the fear of black men in American society and how it often ends in violence against them, co-host Gayle King announced as she introduced a segment in the 8 a.m. ET hour. The headline on the screen blared, "History of Fear. Experts explain why some conflate blackness with crime." And they interview all these people. And lo and behold, one of the people they interview,
one of the experts
that sounds exactly like a useful idiot, is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Why don't you start reading there with, it says later.
Later in the 8:30 a.m. ET half hour, King interviewed former basketball star and left-wing activist Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who seized on the turmoil to defend former NFL player Colin Kaepernick, bash Republicans, and claim racism was, quote, ingrained in our society, close quote.
Now, let me stop you there. Colin Kaepernick is who I was referring to earlier, that second-string football player.
Yeah.
Who's made a lot of money, more money than I'll see in a lifetime, sitting on the bench.
Yeah.
And he's done that where? Here in the United States of America.
Yeah.
Anyway, please
continue. He wasn't
continue.
playing Canadian football. King marveled over a, quote, very powerful op-ed, quote, he wrote in the Los Angeles Times, quoting, "Let me just say your op-ed brought tears to my eyes. The headline is, don't understand the protest. What you're seeing is people rush to the edge." Abdul-Jabbar launched into a list of grievances while seemingly to justify some of the violence seen at the protests. Quoting, "Everybody," and this is, I think, Jabbar speaking here.
Yes.
"Everybody, I think, remembers what Colin Kaepernick went through, and his protest was a peaceful protest about this very issue, and he was ostracized. He lost his job, and he was blackballed for it. That was peaceful protest. That's what it got him. That's the benefit that it got him, and nothing has changed since then. White cops still can act with impunity and kill people that they feel like they want to kill. It's got to stop someplace. And powerless people have no voice. A lot of them are losing their opportunity to vote because the Republicans are working very hard to limit voter participation. So what tools do these people have to effect change?" Close quote. King followed up, quote, "Racism in America, you say, is like dust in the air. Explain what you mean by that." Abdul-Jabbar happily obliged. Well, quoting now, "Well, it's just like have you ever been in a room and there's something, you feel a little something itching in your nose? There's something in the air, a dust or pollen that you can't see. Racism is like that. It's ingrained in our society, and it's taken for granted. And all of the things that are taken for granted can accumulate and be deadly on certain segments of the population. And it comes down on the heads of poor people and people of color, close quote. Rather than have a thoughtful discussion about race relations and bring in a wide variety of perspectives on the incredibly complex topic, CBS instead decided to automatically paint all white people as villains who don't care if black people live or die. How does that kind of rhetoric bring people together to address such a serious issue?
Now, this mindset right here, where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is Muslim, his name used to be Lou Alcindor before he converted to Islam, he calls racism something in the air, a dust or a pollen that you can't see. Racism is like that. It is ingrained in our society. In other words, we made no progress racially in the past.
Right.
And America is so rotten to the core that we just kind of inhale the toxic atmosphere of racism. We're all racist and we just don't realize it.
Yeah.
And so that's why the system has to be toppled and replaced.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the argument that's being made.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they call this, social justice, institutional racism. I was listening to one fellow defending institutional racism, and he was a white individual, and he says, I knew I was racist when I was standing in line at a conference, and I turned to a black person who was in that same line, and I asked that person, can you get me a cup of water? Thinking he was the waiter, when in reality he was a fellow conference attender, a fellow conference presenter. But because he was black, I assumed he was the waiter. In which case, upon hearing this, my response is, well, that's just stupidity on your part.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with racism.
Right.
And yet, this is the argument that's being made.
Yeah.
The society that we're in started with racism. It's inherently racist. Looting and mayhem and violence in the streets are justified. Murder is justified.
Yeah.
Because it's all in the name of toppling this evil system and replacing it with something else. That mindset is what has reached its zenith in the past week with these protests in American society. And tell me if I'm overstating things.
No, and I think, the thing, I hope people caught this in what I just read, because when Jabbar was describing the Colin Kaepernick situation, notice he really kind of leaves you with a feeling that, his peaceful protest didn't get what he needed, so therefore something else needs to happen.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Social change.
Yeah. Well, or violence.
Or violence, yeah.
I think that's what I'm seeing there.
Yes. So this is an example. Mark Cuban, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the Fairfax County Democratic Party. I mean, these are all people that are parroting the line.
Yeah.
And the Marxists love to use these people because they're people of influence.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people are going to listen to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I grew up wanting to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
What is the word I'm trying to say? I idolized him,
Absolutely.
as a young man growing up.
Absolutely.
Loved him as a basketball player.
And these are the things that are routinely coming out of his mouth. Here's a useful idiot I really hate to bring up, George W. Bush.
Yeah.
In news.yahoo.com, the title of the article, June 2nd, 2020, George W. Bush calls on the United States to examine its tragic failures. And I've got this part of it underlined. The tragedy in a long series of similar tragedies raises a long and overdue question. How do we end, here's our buzzword, systemic racism in our society? So here even is George W. Bush, who I voted for twice, parroting this same line.
Yeah.
And so the highest levels can become, useful idiots.
Yeah.
And here's something, Brother Jim, that really gripped me this week. In fact, when I saw this, immediately I thought that civilization is on the brink. I mean, prior to this point in time, I've always thought there's hope. But when I saw this happening, I thought this was a turning point. And it's a video capturing more than 50 police officers, taking a knee in solidarity with protesters. And this comes from theblaze.com by Sarah Taylor, June the 3rd, 2020. These are leading law enforcement people bowing the knee to protesters. Now here we have a picture of Mayor Garcetti, I believe this is, in Los Angeles, and he goes out to where these protests are happening. And there he is on one knee bowing down. Now, in his mind, he is expressing solidarity with the injustice that's committed to George Floyd. If that were all that were going on here, I would say no problem.
Yes.
But what do you think when Putin looks at this? What do you think he thinks? I mean, he sees a man groveling. He sees a man acquiescing to the demands of this mob, and the premise behind this mob is a Marxist revolution. I mean, this really gets scary when you get leading law enforcement agents and people running entire cities. We're not just talking about Hollywood types. We're talking about people with actual political power that are on their knees. And you'll notice also he has his mask on.
I see that, yeah.
So he's acquiescing to the propaganda of COVID-19. And here he is in public with a symbolic gesture, licking the boots of communist thugs. That's how I interpret this. How do you interpret it?
No, I agree. I think it's sad because, you know, he's actually, whether he intends it or not, he's giving his stamp of approval to those protesters. That's a problem.
He's saying a lot more here than what happened to George Floyd was an injustice. What he's doing is he's acquiescing to the idea that the whole system is rigged. And consequently, the whole system needs to be replaced.
Well, he could have directed his efforts directly toward the Floyd family. That's not what he's doing.
That's not what he's doing. And, you know, we're living in a day where symbols are becoming a big deal. Trump holding up his Bible is a big deal. Burning the Quran. I mean, don't do that. That'll cause World War III. A symbol, you know, is a big deal. And here he is in a symbolic presentation. You know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Communicating to this angry mob with its Marxist reparations, redistribution of wealth, burn down the American plantation mindset, and he, not as some guy that runs a website or some guy that's a university professor, but a guy that runs an entire city, not just a city, I mean, one of our most major cities. And here he is on his knee acquiescing to this communist mob. In fact, Tucker Carlson had a great show last night on Fox where he had video footage of this happening all over the country. Professionals are doing this. Law enforcement is doing this. People in high political office are doing it. And symbols mean things.
They do.
And I think when Putin looks at something like this, if he celebrated Christmas, he would say Christmas came early, don't you think?
I think so.
So may God help us. And I saw this and I thought, well, our culture's changed. If this is now the new normal. And that would be tragic enough, but you know, Brother Jim, as we come here to number 12, it's not just people in the secular world doing this. Muslims like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who don't know any better, are doing it. Evangelicals are doing it. Self-professing believers in Jesus Christ, the Trinity, the virgin birth, the Bible as an inspired book, are doing this as well. In fact, here is a quote that has been making its rounds on evangelical Facebook pages, social media, etc. It's a quote from Martin Luther King that says this: "A riot is the language of the unheard. if we are not listening to the peaceful cries of people, we should be surprised, or excuse me, we shouldn't be surprised when the violence happens because we still refuse to listen, close quote. In other words, the rioters are right.
Mm-hmm.
And the riot is happening because it's our fault.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're using this quote from Martin Luther King, an evangelical,
Mm-hmm.
as evangelicals, to promote this. Martin Luther King, of course, being a ordained Baptist minister. I've seen countless evangelicals quoting this
Mm-hmm.
as if the rioters are in the right.
Mm-hmm.
And the rioters are doing what they're doing because, after all, it's our fault. How does that strike you?
I have no words. I'm
Speechless.
flabbergasted. Mm.
Here is a tweet from Melissa Moore. You say, who is that? You ever heard of Beth Moore?
I have.
That's Beth Moore's daughter right there. By the way, Beth Moore, in an article from westernjournal.com, January 1st, 2020, she was outed as a never Trumper back in 2016. And in a tweet responding to a Christian Post editorial, Moore, the then 62-year-old founder of Living Proof Ministries, identified 2016. Now that's the election of Donald Trump is what she's talking about. 2016 as the year her movement, evangelical Christianity, passed away.
Yeah.
So we know what her predilections are.
Yeah.
Now here's her daughter. In the wake of all of these things, riots, blaming who? Blaming the American establishment.
Yeah.
She writes, for the white evangelicals who overwhelmingly voted for this man, Trump, in other words, what does this feel like to you? So what you have are useful idiots within the church.
You know, Pastor, the last time I checked, Jesus said he'd build his church.
Amen.
He didn't say Trump would.
Amen.
Or wouldn't.
Now, is there anything more that Joel Osteen can do to embarrass himself when you think about it?
Well, let's find out.
Here's a tweet from somebody, Matthew Seedorf.
Yeah.
Happening now, Joel Osteen is arriving to the George Floyd March in Houston, and it's a video, if you go watch this, of how Joel Osteen is arriving. Notice he's got his mask on.
I'm biting my lip right now.
And there he is participating in it along with Beth Moore types. One other quick article, and I don't know if we could call this an evangelical useful idiot, but this person certainly would be called a religious useful idiot.
Yeah.
The title of it, it's from thegatewaypundit.com, Jim Hoft, June 2nd, 2020. Unhinged Episcopal Bishop. Now, this particular bishop is female. So that might be a problem there in light of what Paul says about male leadership within the church, but that's another subject.
Yeah.
Unhinged Episcopal Bishop calls into CNN to trash Trump for holding up the Bible without her permission. She's upset about him holding up the Bible, but she says absolutely nothing about the criminals who torched the church that Trump went to. I mean, not one word about that, because that's for the cause. That's overthrowing the racist institutions of the United States. But Trump holding up the Bible, boy, that really brought up her ire, because we all know that the Bible is a symbol of oppression.
Without her permission. Wow.
So, Brother Jim, I really, I've tried to get through this as best I know how. But putting all of this material together was an emotionally taxing thing for me.
Reading it was emotionally taxing for me.
You did a great job, because it shows us how our country is shifting. Burning down the American plantation. The RAM, the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement, the call for reparations, the exploitation of the death of George Floyd, the involvement of George Soros in these things, the obvious involvement of communist agitators. To anybody that wants to see what's happening.
Yeah.
the fact that this is not pandemonium, it's plandemonium, the celebration of the red-green access to this week's looting, the blatant social distancing standard,
Right. Double
the
standard.
blatant attacks on historic sites in the United States.
Yeah.
And, even if some of those sites, we didn't mention this, may have, like let's say they were from the Confederacy. I still don't think those sites should be vandalized and burned down, simply because they're markers showing us where we once were as a society and where we are now.
Yeah.
So there are valid historical markers
that
they're burning down.
They show our progress.
They show our progress. The moral equivalence argument that's being made, all of these secular useful idiots being used, and then you have evangelical useful idiots being swept in as well, not understanding that they're being pulled into an agenda that's anti-American at its core and anti-communist, even though we all mourn the tragic death of George Floyd.
Absolutely, yes.
But we don't celebrate the attacks not on a racist, but on allegedly racism in an entire culture that needs to be toppled.
Right.
So, how then should we conclude? Well, we've got Titus 2, verse 13, which tells us that Jesus is our blessed hope.
That's the truth.
Even if America crumbles, we still have the blessed hope of Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And another, when we've used that verse many times, Titus 2:13, but another one that came to my mind, thinking about all of these things, is something we all ought to be doing as Christians, praying for our country.
That's right.
And what does 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4 tell us?
All right, 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4 from the New American Standard 95 update. Therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth.
So in the midst of this revolution, maybe it's time that we prayed for our leadership in our country so that our culture can be preserved.
Yeah, I agree.
It seems like that's what Paul is calling us to.
I agree.
A few comments and questions came in. It says they also have George Floyd dressed as a Palestinian. They are standing with the left in Gaza. Now that's a very insightful point, because the very argument that is being used to topple the United States, being oppressive at its roots, that is the identical argument being used against the legitimacy of the modern state of Israel. They call it what's the word I'm looking for? An apartheid state.
Yeah.
Even though you have non-Israeli Arabs in the Knesset, on the Supreme Court, even though the Arab population has grown in the land of Israel, not shrunk, which would have happened if Israel really was an oppressive jihad apartheid state.
Right.
The same argument that's being used to topple the United States is being used to topple the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
In fact, Arafat, when he figured out he couldn't beat the Jews in wars, having been shellacked in 48, 67, and 73, went to the Soviets for schooling.
Yeah.
And he learned the art of propaganda.
That's right.
And so he started to make the argument, as then the leader of the PLO, that the nation of Israel is an apartheid state and therefore needs to be toppled and replaced with a Palestinian state. That's why they use the expression from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
The river, the Jordan, the sea, the Mediterranean. They're not after a sliver of Israel.
Right.
They're after the whole thing.
Not just looking for Jerusalem. No.
And they feel they're right in doing it because Israel, they think, is a genocide state.
Yeah.
They slaughtered the Palestinian population that was there beforehand.
Goodness gracious.
Even though Mark Twain went over there and found nothing but sand.
Yeah.
And in fact, he finally ran into a goat, and he said it must be a goat that eats rocks.
Only a goat can eat. Yeah,
because there's no greenery or shrubbery here.
Yeah.
So there was no what's the word
Indigenous,
I'm looking? Indigenous thriving
No,
population
there
that
was.
Israel went in and eradicated. Well, they're making the same argument with the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
We slaughtered the Indians. We
Yeah.
brought in slavery.
Yeah.
And we're furthering it
Yeah.
under the name of white privilege.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I appreciate that point.
Mm-hmm.
A person says plandemic or scamdemic. Very good. Another person says white privilege comes from critical race theory. And that's sort of what we've been talking about here, which was adopted by the Southern Baptist Convention at their 2019 convention. Now, monitor the work of Trevor Loudon, who we quoted earlier, who monitors the movement of Marxist ideas into the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got professors at Southern University, I think is their main school, essentially teaching liberation theology, which is the idea that we're going to mix Marxism with Christianity as if the two had anything in common whatsoever.
Right.
So the SBC, and people say, well, I don't care, I'm not a Baptist. Well, the reason you should care is that is our largest Protestant denomination.
Sure is.
And if that topples, then you're losing one of the great resistors against Marxism. You know, the days of Adrian Rogers and Charles Stanley and Paige Patterson, those are all days of the past.
That's right.
And so it's tragic what's happening.
It is.
That's why broadcasts like this are becoming more and more important. In other words, says it's hard to listen to what these useful idiots say, shaking my head. Another person says the statements made by various celebrities are called virtue signaling. Very good. This reminds me of the approval mentioned in Romans 1, verse 32. Do you mind reading Romans 1, verse 32 to us? Yeah, virtue signaling, where you're looking to influencers in the culture for values, and Marxists would call them useful idiots once you get them to pronounce Marxist propaganda.
Yeah. Romans chapter 1, verse 32, and although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them.
And one final comment here, and says in reference to bowing down to protesters. One person says, my husband feels that those that do will be the ones who will take the mark of the beast. Pretty good insight. In other words, if you're going to acquiesce to a communist mob now, why would you not acquiesce to the mark of the beast following the rapture, later? Yeah. So, anyway, Brother Jim, we went 2 sessions on this subject. I kind of felt it was necessary given the gravity of the situation this week.
I think so.
And I have to be honest, this was not easy for us to do, was it?
No.
To come in here and deal directly with this?
No.
When so few are.
Yeah.
And it was harder to research it. And I know it was hard on you to read all of this stuff. So keep us in your prayers, folks. I think they would like nothing more than to deplatform us and outlets like us. And fortunately, we still have this outlet. And so as long as we're here, we're going to continue to use it to speak the truth.
Amen.
You have any closing thoughts?
The only thing I want to end is, again, we do close with Titus 2:13, remember the blessed hope. But I also was reflecting on 2 Corinthians 5:20 to remind us that there's no better time than the present to be an ambassador for Christ. And people are out there needing to hear the word of salvation. So don't get discouraged with what you're seeing. Be encouraged that what it's telling us is that, the rapture is right around the corner. Let's get as many people in as we can.
Yeah.
So
great incentive for holy living.
Yes.
So we have a tendency to magnify the negative and not look so much at the positive, what we're supposed to be doing.
Well, we have to be balanced.
We've got to be balanced.
Tell the truth, but
Amen.
Tell the truth.
Do us a favor, would you? Can you just click share on Facebook and expand our message
Yes,
into your
yes.
friends list. And don't do it once, do it twice. Because today we did a part 1 and a part
that's
2.
right. That's right.
So with that being said, we're going to sign off, and we'll see you soon. God bless.
God bless.